Today's shiur is Nazir Daf Chof Hey. Take note that today's shiur will begin at the bottom line of Daf Chof Dalid Amid Beis. We see there a Dibur HaMaschil, a quote from a Tanaic source that we saw toward the end of our previous shiur, which reads, Meis v'hoyu lo mo'is stumin yiplu l'nedava. You can use your arrow that you see to the side of the Gemara text and align it with the arrow above, and you'll see where this is quoted from. Before we get into the Gemara itself, we have a topic heading, a nosei that we've written on the side of the Gemara, which reads as follows. Li'el kotoni bebraisa. Earlier, as we pointed out with our arrows, it was taught in the Braisa, Shemi shehifrish mois l'naziruso. Someone who had set aside money to purchase the required Nazir sacrifices, umeis, and the person died, v'hoyu lo mois stumen, and the money that he had set aside were stumen. Stumen means they were undefined, namely they were not earmarked. Exactly what constitutes stumen versus mefurashin specified, that's something the Gemara will touch on later. However, for our purposes, it's enough to recognize that the monies are stumen, meaning they're unspecified. We say yiplu l'nedava. The money is used to purchase olah sacrifices that are used when the mizbeach experiences called downtime. It's called olos l'keitz ha-mizbeach. Bear in mind that a Nazir that needs to bring sacrifices, that he has to buy sacrifices at the conclusion of his Nazirus, he needs 3 sacrifices. Assuming that he was a Nazir Tohar, that he had not defiled himself, he has to bring a Chatas, an Olah, and a Shlomim. We mentioned just now that if the monies were undefined, the Tanaic source told us that he brings Olah sacrifices. A Gemara Tish'al, the Gemara will ask, Hey, Echi Tachein, how can that be? V'harei demei chatos murav bahen. Amongst the monies that are there was the ultimate need to purchase from those monies a korban chatos. And a korban chatos has rules based on an oral tradition that dictate that if a person who had set aside a chatas doesn't need it anymore, so if it's money that was set aside and he died, the money is to be disposed of in the Dead Sea, where the money will rot away. And if it's an animal, so the animal is set aside to die, it cannot be used. So we have these undefined monies, and we're saying use all of them for olah sacrifices, when in fact the potential for using some of those monies for the purchase of chatas is mixed in. We have just a side point that we want to add here, and that is that Gambe Mishnosein Muska Hamikra Shel Isha Shenodra Benazirus V'Frisha Mois Ve'Efer Lo Baila. A woman who had accepted upon herself a vow of Nazirus, and she set aside cash, and the husband then annulled her vow, voiding her Nazirus. Im hoyu stumen, if the monies that she set aside were undefined, the Mishnah said the same thing as we saw above, yiplu l'nedava. We have 2 cases of a previous or former Nazir who at this point does not need to purchase the Nazir sacrifices. And we've got monies that he or she had set aside, and amongst the monies was the chatos potential money, and we were taught that take the most stumen and use them for nedava, for the purchase of olah sacrifices. Now, the Gemara continues at the top of Chof Hey Amid Aleph with our question, V'halo demei chatos muravin bahen. Is it not so that chatos monies are mixed in? How can we then say that they are used to purchase olah, nedava sacrifices? Omar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha hi benazir. Rabbi Yochanan answers, this is an oral tradition, that even though chatos monies are mixed in, they are to be used for the purchase of nedovas, of olah sacrifices. Reish Lakish Omar, Reish Lakish has a different shot, and he says l'chol nidrayim u'l'chol nidvoisam. From this pasuk, we learn HaTorah Omra. The Torah teaches us Moisar neder yehei l'nedava. The word Mosar is a reference to monies that are not necessary anymore for their original sacrificial purposes. So whatever is Mosar that was dedicated as something specific and it's not necessary, it is used as Nedava, as we mentioned, for the purpose of buying olah sacrifices that are used as Nedava, the voluntary type offerings. The Rashi, on the second line from the top, Moiser neder yehei Nedava v'ochanami, here too, Kevon dahani mois lo tzrichi, since the monies spoken about are not necessary anymore, shikvar meis, the person who had set them aside, the Nazir that had set them aside, is now dead. Havaluhu mosar, they fall into that category, the unnecessary monies. The yiplu l'nedava, and they're used for buying the nedava type sacrifices. The ein choshishin l'dmei chatos shabem, and we don't concern ourselves with the chatos monies that are mixed in. We continue now with the analysis of these two shitas, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, in light of the sources they gave. Bishlam ala Rabbi Yochanan to Amar halacha hi ben Nazir. As far as Rabbi Yochanan is concerned, things are smooth because he said that there is an oral tradition, amtu lahachi, and therefore stumen in mefurashin lo. If the monies were undefined, then they are used for nedava purchases. But if they were earmarked and they were defined, then we don't say that. This distinction is all part of the oral tradition. The oral tradition having stated that most stumen that were set aside for Nazir purposes are nedava, not if they were specified. And that is exactly what we had learned in our sources. Ela Reish Lakish, who says l'chol nidreim u'l'chol nidvosam, who cited that pasuk, my irya stumen. Why does the Tanaic source speak about undefined monies as being yiplu l'nedava? According to the drasha suggested, afilu mifurashin, even if the monies had been earmarked, then we should have said, take all those monies, because of this gezeres hakosav, the man is dead now, and buy nedava sacrifices. And yet we saw in the source back on Chavdal and Mebeis that if the mos were mifurashin, they were specified, so the chatas money goes to the Amamelach, the olah money is brought as an olah, and the shlomim is used to purchase shlomim. The Gemara answers, and note we have a long answer. What is going to happen then, structurally in the Gemara, a Tanaic source will be quoted which provides the answer why we don't say that if they were mefurashin, they become nedava. And following the source, you'll notice points that were mentioned in the source will then be reviewed and explained. And those are introduced with a diamond marking that you can see. The first one, you can see 5 lines from the bottom at the end of the line. And the next one, you can see the second line from the top of Amid Beis. So now let's go back to our Gemara. Omar Rava, Mefurashin lo motzis amris. To suggest that most Mefurashin should be used as, let's say, a lump sum for the purchase of Nedavas, that you cannot say. Kvar Poska Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. This matter has already been decided and ruled upon by the Tanaic source that it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. And we learn from this source that all Mosar Chatos goes Lamisa. And a Vlad Chatos that's cited in this source is just an example of Mosar Chatos. The Tosfos also can be learned for introductory purposes. Let's look together at the Tosfos. Dimra Mascho Mefurashin. It says Mefurashin lo motzis amris yiblu nedava. If the funds were earmarked, where you cannot say that it should go l'nedava, and therefore the pasuk that Reish Lakish cited will be limited to stumen, not the undefined monies, not the defined monies. Why? The Kvar Pasuk Tani Rabbi Shmuel. Devlad chatos mesa v'lo linedava. A chatos, a sin offering, a female animal that bore an offspring after it was sanctified as a chatos, it is set aside. The vlad, that offspring, is set aside to die. V'lo linedava. It's not used for the purchase, or it's not the vlad chatos, that offspring is not used as a nidava, as a voluntary offering for the mizbeach. V'hachinami, and here too, just like there we said the vlad chatos is mesa, here too name of the mosar shelah, the unnecessary monies that were associated with the chatos, as would be the case in the earmarked chatos funds and the owner dying, the leibud azil v'lo linedava, it goes for as a loss, meaning it's set aside in the case of monies sent to the Dead Sea, and it's not set aside, or not brought as for the purchase of nidava sacrifices. Ta'kol nikra moser chatas. All of these are called moser chatas, and that's why we defined it before as the unnecessary. Bein vlad chatos, bein tmuras chatos kihacha, whether it be like what's cited in this source that we haven't read yet, a chatos offspring, or an animal that was a tmuras chatos. That's an animal upon which was replicated by your declaring a second chulin animal, a replica of a pre-existing chatos. That is forbidden to do, and if you did it, so the tmuras chatos is mesa. Ki hacha de mafresh mefurashin v'hefer lo baila, like our Mishnah, where the woman set aside monies and defined them, earmarked part of the money for Ola, part of the money for Shloma, and part of the money for Chatos. And the husband then voided her vow, so we say the same thing, that those Chatos monies are le'ibud. Like the Tanaic source we saw quoted earlier on Chav Daled Amid Beis, that a person who had set aside monies for his Nazirus sacrifices, and then he died, and he had defined monies, we specified already what needs to be done with them. Kol eila she'enon chatos atzmon, all these examples that are not the actual chatos animal, she'em moisoros aleim, they're categorized as mosoros. Now, with that having been said, we go to the Gemara to see the source which answers the question raised on Reish Lakish, why, when it comes to mefurashin, we don't say linedava. The source says, Rak kodoshecha asher yulach unidorecha. The pasuk is quoted in its fuller sense as the source continues. So if you skip a line, you can see it says Tiso Bosal Amokom Asher Yivchar Hashem, and then the next pasuk, which is pasuk Chavav, is quoted even a few lines later. V'yosiso Eloisecha Boser V'Adam. So with this in mind, that we have a pasuk from Dvorim Yud Beis pasuk Chavav, it is being darshaned, and we will see what we need to see by way of the answer. So the pasuk says, this pasuk is telling us what to do with vladei kochim, with the offspring of sacrifices and their replicas. Ma takonasan, well, what do you do with them, with the vladei kochim and the tmuros? And I know we might sound a little repetitive, but bear in mind, as we learn this, we're also talking about the Ma'os Mefurashin mentioned earlier that were not needed anymore. So what do? Tisa Uvasal Amokim Asher Yivchar Hashem. The continuation of Pasuk Chavav says, you bring them to the appointed place, to the Beis HaMikdash. Yochol Yalim LeBeis HaBechira V'yimna Mehem Mayim Umazon B'shvil Shamusu. Is the idea here that you bring them to the Beis HaMikdash and withhold from them water and foods in order for them to die? Talmud Lomar V'yosisa Oiloisecha Haboser V'Adam. That's Pasuk Chav Zayin. Lomar Loch, and it tells us the following: Kederech Shata Noig Ba'Oilo Noig B'Tumurasa. Whatever you were going to do with an original Ola, do so with the Tumura. Kederech Shata Noig B'Shlamim nehog bivlodehem. Whatever you would have done with an original shlomim sacrifice, as opposed to an ola, which is only from a male type, a male gender animal, the shlomim can be from a female also, and if you have a shlomim animal that happened to have an offspring, do to the offspring what you would have done to its mother. Treat it the same way. Yochol af vlad chatos utmuras osham kain. Would you say the same thing with regard to the offspring of a chatos and the replica of an osham, a guilt offering? In other words, treat the vlad chatos the same way you would have treated the mother animal. Talmud lomar rak divrei Rabbi Yishmael. The word rak, which we saw in the pasuk, the beginning of pasuk Chavav, is a limitation expression, telling us that the idea of treating the vlodois and the tmurois as you would the original animal is limited to oila and shlomim. It does not apply to the vlad chatos nor to the tmuras osham. Osham also, by the way, is only a male animal. That's why you don't see vlad by osham. Rabbi Kiva Omer Eino Tzorech. You don't need to cite rak for that purposes. Harei Omer Osham Hu B'Hav Yoso Yehei. With regard to a korban osham, it says osham hu, meaning it remains as it is, which is itself a limiting expression that you find by the osham sacrifice. That limitation teaches us that only an osham, an original osham, is brought as an osham, not, in this case, not its tmura. So our hope is that you can see that most mefuroshin, if they're not necessary, they're considered mosar, are not treated as a nedava, but each item as it originally was earmarked. And when it comes to the chatos monies, they are sent to the Dead Sea. Kotoni. Here you see, as we have indicated on the side under the Mivneh heading, Kotoni tzitutim me'abraisa. These are quotes like you find in other Gemaras. It'll say Omar Mar, a quote from something mentioned earlier. So it said in this source, and you can see we have a little arrow, you can use it to align with the arrow above, dealing with the Vlodei Kodshim and the Tmurasan, the offspring of sacrifices and their Tmura. There was a thought mentioned, Yochol Yalem Lebeis HaBechir V'yimne Mehem Mayim Umazon B'shvil Shiamusu. Should I withhold from them drink and food in order for them to die? Tamalomar V'yosisa Oiloisecha. The pasuk says, no, you don't do that. You process them. The Gemara asks, Amai, why do I need a special Gzeres HaKosov to tell me that I offer the Vlad Shlomim and the Tmura of the Ola? And the pasuk is thereby telling me, don't think that you bring them to the Beis HaBechira in order for them to die. So why do I need the pasuk to tell me that? Vlad chatos hu de gemirin ba misa. We have an oral tradition that says a Vlad chatos is the one that is set aside to die. Only the Vlad chatos. And being that that's the case, so I wouldn't have thought that the Vlad of a Shlomim is set aside to die. So I don't need the pasuk to tell me something I would have known anyway. I would have known it from the oral tradition, as this concept of lemisa is limited to the chatos, to the Vlad chatos. The Gemara answers, Ilav kro, had I not had our pasuk of Yosisa Oiloisecha, Have Amina, I would have thought as follows: Vlad chatos b'chol makom. If you have a chatos sacrifice that bore an offspring, it is to die, but anywhere, not specifically in the Beis Hamikdash. Vlodei Kodshim, the offspring of other sacrifices, like we mentioned, the Shlomim offspring, but Beis HaBechir, I would have thought it is set aside to die, but in the Beis Hamikdash, meaning in a specific place, the Beis Hamikdash. Komash Malon, the pasuk comes to tell me below that it's not set aside to die at all, even in the Beis Hamikdash. Kotani, once again, a quote from the source. Use the star that you see to the immediate right-hand side of the Gemara text, indicating to go back to Omid Aleph, and you'll see where this quote comes from. Yochol af vlad chatos utmuras osham kain talmud loma rak. Would you have thought that you'll process the vlad chatos and the tmura of the ocean as you would the original animal? So the pasuk says, no, rak. This concept of treating the vlad and the tmura as the original is limited to shlomim and oila. Loma likra. What do I need a pasuk for this purpose? Hilchasa gemiri law. We have an oral tradition that says vlad chatos lamisa azel. The offspring of a chatos is set aside to die. So from the oral tradition, I would have known what we used the rak citation in order to teach. The Gemara says, Hachinami, you're right. You don't need the rak word from the pasuk to tell me that the vlad chatos would not be processed as the original, because we know the vlad chatos through the oral tradition is set aside to die. Ukra, no, we have a number 1 over here, because this is really the first in 2 stages. So the pasuk ukra la'osham hu da'asa. The rak pasuk is telling me about the tmuras osham, that it is not treated as the original. Again, the Gemara asks, but osham nami hilchasa gemiri law. There is an oral tradition that governs what one does with the tmuras osham. I don't need the pasuk of rak. What does the oral tradition say? Kol sheilu bechatas mesa beosham ro'er. The scenario by a chatas that would lead to its death. Take, for example, tmuras chatos. If someone replicated the chatos sacrifice onto a chulin animal, that tmura, that replication, is set aside to die. So the oral tradition says that whatever happens to the chatos will happen to the osham. Meaning, if you have a tmuras osham, it's not set aside to die, but it's set aside to graze until it develops a blemish, and then it is sold, and you buy an olah offering with it. So as far as a tmuras osham is concerned, I don't need the pasuk to tell me it's not treated as the original. I have this oral tradition that tells me what to do with it. The Gemara answers, Ella, ime hilchasa, had I had just the oral tradition, have amina hilchasa, I would have thought that there's an oral tradition that says, in the case of the chatos, it is set aside to die. The akrive lo l'chayev olev lo klum. And if I violated the oral tradition and I offered the vlad chatos as a sacrifice, I wouldn't be considered in violation of any Torah scripture. In other words, the oral tradition tells me what you ought to do. If I didn't listen to it, I did not heed the oral tradition, and I offered it, I would be not in violation of anything. Chomash malon kra. The pasuk tells me, the makriv lei, if you go ahead and offer the vlad chatos instead of setting it aside to die, koyim alei ba'aseh, you have violated a positive command of the Torah, as is represented by the pasuk rak kodshecha shiulach unidorecha. Let us continue in the Gemara. Rabbi Akiva Omer Eino Tzorich Harehu Omer Osham Hu Bav Yoso Yehei. Rabbi Akiva says, you, in contrast to Rabbi Shmuel, you don't need the word rak to tell me that the Osham would not be treated as the original, or the Tmuras Osham would not be treated as the original. I don't need the rak for that, Rabbi Akiva says. I can learn that from the Osham Hu pasuk, which means only the original Osham is treated as an Osham and not the Tmura of it. The Gemara asks, Loma likra, what do I need a pasuk for? The same kind of question as we asked before within Rabbi Shmuel. We're asking on Rabbi Akiva. Gemara, Gemirin law. We have an oral tradition. Kol shebechatos mesa ba'asham roya. If by the chatos it would be set aside to die, as would be the case in a tmuras chatos, the asham equivalent, the tmuras asham, is set aside to graze in the fields until it develops a blemish. One thing is clear, the oral tradition tells me what to do with the tmuras asham. What does Rabbi Akiva need to cite a pasuk for? The Gemara says, Hachi nami. You're right. The oral tradition really does cover it. V'chi kra l'derav. And the pasuk, Asham hu, that's needed for Rav's teaching. The Omer of Hunam Rav, Asham shenitak l'raya, a korban Asham that nitak means removed from its Asham status. Tosfos explains it was given over to a shepherd to have it graze in the fields until it develops a blemish. That's the result of some of the examples we mentioned before. For the Tmuras Asham, for example, if you have a Korban Asham whose owner died, it's not needed anymore. The Korban Asham is an atonement offering. It's called a guilt offering. If the owner is dead, Meisu Bailov, you don't need it anymore. So it would be given over to a shepherd to graze until the animal develops a blemish, because prior to the development of a blemish, it has its original sanctity and it can't be used as a korban asham. The owner is dead. So it's given to a shepherd who will graze it until the animal develops a blemish, and as we said, it could be then sold to buy a korban olah. So asham shenitak l'raya. V'shachtoi l'shem olah, and before it developed the mum, before it developed the blemish would have enabled me to sell the animal and use the monies to buy an olah. But before that happened, you brought it, this asham animal, this original asham animal, after it was set out to graze, but before it developed the mum, you brought it as an olah sacrifice, kosher, it's acceptable. And Rav qualifies this. He says, Taima de nitak. It's a kosher as an olah animal because it was already removed from its asham status by having given it to the shepherd to have it graze. Ha lo nitak lo. However, if you had an asham sacrifice whose owner died, and was still in the owner's house, it wasn't given over to the shepherd yet, it didn't have, a formal ruling upon it, that it's set aside to graze, then at that early point, if you would bring it as an olah, it would not be acceptable. The Omar Kra, the pasuk says, "Who?" We had before the pasuk Asham who? B'havyoso Yehei. That means that an Asham remains as an Asham. It can't change. Its status can't be changed just by your deciding to use it as an olah. Your mere decision is not enough. It would have to be nitak l'raya, set aside or given over to the shepherd for grazing, as we explained before, in order for it to eventually develop a blemish, and you would use the money. But at the early original point of time, merely choosing the asham to be used as an olah, even if the owner had died, that would not be an acceptable olah sacrifice. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.